Hello and welcome to Politics Today. I'm Farrukh Pitafi. Once again, we are going to talk about Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan and Afghanistan's economy continue to worsen. One reason would be Taliban's rule, because Taliban are not that much trained in today's challenges when it comes to ruling the country. They were in power 20 years ago. The other thing, of course, is regarding the world community's reaction. So far, various countries and the UN have been highlighting it as very important that the world community actually engages with Afghanistan. But the problem with any country where the state collapses in a single day, and where the new rulers don't have that kind of insight or that kind of muscle memory of ruling. The problem is, even if you bring in the humanitarian support, how do you conduct it? There seems to be a lot of checks, and there seems to be a lot of bottlenecks. That is one aspect which is very important. The other thing, of course, is Taliban's own intolerance so far. They haven't allowed women to partake the national activity. Many women have not returned to their jobs. Girls are not allowed to go to the school. So all this makes a lot of chaos. We are going to talk about all these matters and more, how to find a way out. Before I introduce the panel we have got today, let me quote the Army Chief, the Chief of Army Staff, General Qamar Javed Bajwa, who said there is a need of global convergence on Afghanistan to avoid humanitarian crisis, together with coordinated efforts for economic uplift of the Afghan people. At this moment, it is very important that we look at this, but unfortunately, with the Western media and pundits, it seems that when the whole show was going on, evacuations were going on, Afghanistan found a lot of attention, probably for the wrong reasons. But now, hardly anybody is talking about Afghanistan. We are going to talk about all these matters. In order to help us understand these issues, in the studio, I'm joined by Brigadier Retired Rashid Wali Jajua Sahab, who's a senior analyst associated with the IPRI. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Asad Jan Sahab also joins us in the studio, who is an expert on international affairs. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program.
Thank you.
And Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director and Senior Associate of South Asia at Wilson Center, also joins us. Michael, thank you very much. Always great having you in the show. With you, gentlemen, if you allow me, I'm going to first with Michael. Michael, I don't want to actually color the discussion with my own views. I want to understand where the world community is regarding Afghanistan, and what exactly is the perception of the developing situation. Your take first, then I'm going to go to other guests. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I thank you for having me, as always. I think that it's hard to characterize the international community's perceptions right now because it varies. I think there clearly is a recognition of just how serious this humanitarian crisis is, and just how catastrophic it can become in a matter of days if you don't get enough money into the country anytime soon. But the problem is how to act, how to act on that collective concern. There have been a series of conferences and meetings between different governments, but they've been siloed. The G7 had a meeting not too long ago. The G20 had met about how to bring humanitarian relief to Afghanistan. There had been a Russia-led effort that happened, but you're not talking about larger, collective, more global, organized efforts to bring assistance to Afghanistan. And I think that's the concern, that we talk so often about how there's not enough multilateralism in this world, and that you don't now have enough of a truly global consensus on how to move forward on a lot of global challenges. And certainly the issue of Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis is a part of that. And here in Washington, I think there's quite frankly a strong degree of indecision. I just don't think the U.S. knows how it wants to proceed. It knows that it is not willing to recognize the Taliban government. And so that means it knows that it is not in a position where it would want to deliver assistance directly to the Taliban government. But
very quickly, sorry to cut you, but very quickly, can you explain why recently there was a Troika Plus meeting in Russia, and the U.S. was going to be there, but it was not? Can you explain why the U.S. chose not to go there?
I don't have a good answer, particularly because the U.S. had participated in previous Troika meetings. As you know, the U.S. had been willing to decouple its bilateral tensions with Russia, and China, for that matter, from this broader desire to engage in regional diplomacy on Afghanistan. And the administration here had said that it was a technical or a logistical constraint, which does not make any sense to me. The U.S. has pledged to cooperate with Russia down the road on this issue, but at a moment when the situation is so serious in Afghanistan, to me it makes no sense for the Americans not to have participated in that meeting, especially given how important the regional players were at the table at that conference, Russia and China and Pakistan, of course, as well.
Right. Let me come to the studio now, Brigadier Sir, your take on Afghanistan and how the world at this moment is perceiving it, how Islamabad is perceiving it.
Yes, at the world level, the efforts are desultory and fragmented at the moment.
Okay.
Individually, the countries are cognizant of this reality. UN humanitarian community is cognizant. United States itself has pledged some time back something like 64 million alone. Canada has pledged 50 million and another 23 million, so total 73. Russia has also pledged. The statement of the presidential representative Kabulov, it clearly said that Russia is also going to provide the humanitarian aid. China is doing it, but there is no coherence and there is no sense of urgency. And if you see the statement of Martin Griffiths, UNOCHA chief, it clearly mentions that the UN has not confronted a graver crisis than this in the realm of food insecurity. So it's a kind of the vicissitudes of Afghans are being compounded. It's a perfect storm. COVID-19, drought, then the unemployment.
Economy is collapsing.
Economy is collapsing. So all this is leading towards a humanitarian crisis, and the IPS report clearly spells out the dangers. The heads of FAO and WFP, David Beasley, he has very clearly stated that 7.3 million people are at peril, especially in the rural areas where the livelihoods are threatened because of the drought, and because of droughts since the last 4 years, the crops have been badly affected.
Right.
40% of the wheat crop has been hit in Afghanistan. And there's a La Nina effect, and if it continues till 2022, there would be migration, starvations, and for the first time in Afghanistan's history, probably in the recent history, urban areas are also being affected.
Right.
So this crisis is very real, and the international community needs to do something quickly before the onset of winter.
Right, and that is very important. When I come back to you, I'm going to ask you, why is it that the world community is not that much motivated right now? But allow me to bring in Asad Jan Sahab. Your take, sir, your opening comment about Afghanistan.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's very unfortunate with Afghanistan that it's like almost the 3 months going to happen of the Kabul fall, and nobody is recognizing, and nobody is having that sense of urgencies that the winter is coming, and obviously the whole community is aware that winter is obviously that lethal effect in Afghanistan, and due to the poverty and the winter, and there was a report that the 80% the health departments or the health facilities dependent on the international aid. So the one thing,
and they are not paying salaries,
and they are not paying salaries
for quite a long time.
So after 3 months, if the international community is helpless or somehow do not recognize the Afghanistan government. So obviously there is something within the international community, or rather the Afghanistan. But obviously the Islamic Emirates or the Taliban, they come to power after the Doha deal. So if the Doha deal has been signed between the Taliban and the American government, and they come to power with the proper agreement, so obviously the US should be the first one to recognize the Afghanistan hukumat, and followed by all the international community.
There seems to be some reaction also, right?
Yes.
The gentleman who signed the deal from the US side has resigned.
Yes.
By now.
That's a big. That's the failure.
And they seem to be disowning it. But my concern is that there were classified portions of it. If you don't actually abide by that agreement, why don't you disclose it?
Well, the reason is that since I'm following the US media or the US organization, so after the fall of Kabul, the US government has received immense pressure from within the media, and somehow they call it like the biggest defeat of the US army or the US government in Afghanistan. So somehow, I mean, they are not realizing, or they have realized in a sense that if they are recognizing Afghanistan within that, I mean, immediately, so obviously there will be another backlash from the media its own.
Right.
So and that's the reason.
And the approval ratings actually keep on tanking.
Yes.
So they seem to be somehow frozen in action at this moment. Allow me to go back to Michael Kugelman. Michael, I asked one question. Let me ask you about it also. If you remember, last time we were discussing Doha deal, I asked you whether there were classified parts or not, and you said there were. Now it seems that the US treats it as something which is null and void. If it is the case, why is it that we haven't seen those classified parts actually surfacing or coming to our attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there have been a number of individuals, particularly members of Congress on Capitol Hill, that have received briefings that relate to these parts of the Doha Accord that have not been made public. But you know, even though you hear the lip service in Washington given to the Doha Accord, I think that agreement is pretty much null and void. It's pretty much dead, right? Just because you know, that was an agreement that was meant to set in motion an intra-Afghan dialogue between members of the previous government and Taliban officials, and that didn't happen. Of course, as we know, the previous Afghan government and the military collapsed. The Taliban took over power. It did not share power with anyone. It has not shared power with anyone. So my sense is that the Doha process is pretty much dead. And you know, you hear some individuals, including Zalmay Khalilzad, in a recent interview with a U.S. TV outlet here, about you know, working towards some type of power sharing deal, and that's well and good. But it looks to me that this Taliban government, which is an interim government, is perfectly comfortable ruling 100% on its own. So my point here is that it looks like, you know, this Doha Accord is pretty much dead in the water, which I think makes it less important for policy reasons to get a hold of those parts of the agreement that were not made public. I think for academic reasons, it certainly, and for reasons of democracy and transparency, it makes sense to have those non-public versions of the agreement made public. But I think in terms of public policy, clearly Afghanistan has gone in such a different direction right now that I think that so much of what came out of those negotiations and that agreement have lost their relevance, unfortunately.
Right. And while you were talking about lack of action, or perhaps everybody doing whatever they were doing in silos, I thought that humanitarian concerns may not be that much compelling. But when you talk about the threat of immigration or migration, that actually usually propels a lot of governments to come forward and do something about it. At this moment, is that not a real threat? Or there is a lot of fatigue regarding immigration, or because of COVID and all these crises, these countries, these powerful countries are not that much bothered?
I think that there's a very strong link to be made here between the need for humanitarian assistance and the risk of migration and refugee flows. But I think this is something that really has a lot of stakes for Europe, more so than the U.S., just because it's very clear that if you don't get enough humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan soon, you're going to have another new major refugee crisis on the borders of Europe, right? And we've already seen in recent years that large numbers of Afghans have been traveling to Europe via the Mediterranean. Especially when they conclude that it's not realistic for them to go to Iran or to Pakistan. They've been going to Europe, and certainly given the scale of this humanitarian crisis that Afghanistan is facing now, it's all but inevitable, I think, that Europe could soon face another major Afghan refugee challenge. And in previous years, when you've had Afghan refugees coming to Europe, most of the EU countries have not been particularly receptive to taking on Afghan refugees. And I'm not sure, it's unclear to me if that's going to change this time. There's been different inconsistent messages from different EU governments, but clearly this humanitarian crisis is also a refugee crisis, just because, yes,
right.
The war has ended for now, but the trigger for...
Yeah, allow me to come back to the studio. Michael, I'm going to come to you. Brigadier Saab, you have listened to his comments as well. Immigration might be, or migration actually, a refugee crisis might be a huge concern, especially in Europe, where it seems that the European countries are ready to commit to some kind of aid, but they're changing in character also. In France, the far right is very quickly rising. Within the past few weeks, it has risen beyond anybody's imagination. In Germany, there's going to be another government, which we don't know how they are going to treat this policy. Is there a possibility, while the world does whatever it does, Pakistan, which actually keeps on raising the issue of Afghan humanitarian concerns, actually goes to Afghan Taliban and tell them, if you do these few things, the world is going to recognize you and help you in actually all policy issues. Why can't we actually allow girls to go to school, be more inclusive, take care of humanitarian issues, develop institutions in such and such way? Why is it not possible?
Well,
okay.
My take on this is very simple. I think we should be very wary while dealing with the Taliban government, because we don't have a lot of clout on them.
Yeah.
It is for them to decide what kind of governance structure, what kind of sociological system they want to have. We can advise them, and I think in many ways those advices are still, the channels are open.
No.
What we can perhaps, the better way of helping them would be that we have a lot of experience in humanitarian crisis management,
Right.
and we have had the 2005 earthquake, in which armed forces and the humanitarian agencies, nearly 100,
Right.
they all gel together.
Okay.
And one of the pressing issues in Afghanistan is the security situation. And one of the concerns cited by Martin Griffiths was the security and safety and their ability to go back from where they are at the moment to get deployed onto the hubs.
Right.
Now, this is an experience, this is a template which we can offer, and we can render the necessary assistance in crisis management, our NDMA and those government organizations
Right.
which we've been dealing.
But if one thing actually holds for one situation, Brigadier Saab, it holds for others as well. If we cannot give them advice, how can we actually send our people to help them over there, right? With due respect, when it comes to, I've seen statements coming from Army Chief, for example, at the start of the takeover, where the Army Chief actually spoke about importance to give women their rights, stick to commitments, be more inclusive. In the end, we have seen that those people who signed Doha Agreement have been shunted to one side, and they are doing, Brigadier Sahab, whatever they are doing. So why not ask them, compel them, because this way, they will not be isolated.
My take on this is that we cannot compel them. Yes, we can render necessary advice, but we should not overcome.
I don't get this but, because I understand no country can compel another, but you can always give the advice. So why say but?
Advice, I think they are already getting from a lot of channels. There is academia, there is the media, there are people to people linkages. State has also
Publicly.
I believe they have publicly stated that I hope there were statements that Taliban would take due cognizance of the international concerns, and one of those pressing concerns is this. And there are good signs. The statement of UNOCHA chief mentioned this aspect that for humanitarian relief operations, the Taliban discussions that he had, they had shown some flexibility to allow the women folk as part of the humanitarian relief process. So there is a silver lining, and I'm sure one of the biggest leverage the international community has over Taliban is the ability to provide them financial succor and humanitarian aid, and I think they would be amenable.
Okay.
And we can start with humanitarian aid, and which, if they allow the women folk, especially there's a crisis. You heard, I believe, WHO chief, he very clearly mentioned that there is a maternal, deaths. That's a serious issue, and there are over 170 women amongst the 560,000 total IDPs.
That's a big number.
So for them, the nurses and midwives and the doctors, female doctors, there is a vacuum, and the Taliban have desired that vacuum be filled. So herein lies the opportunity.
Right. And I understand that is something that might be there. I have two daughters that go to high school. And at this moment, when I actually place myself in that position, where girls who had to go to high school have been stopped, and it has been, like you mentioned, and that it has been 3 months almost that they are not going there. The problem is that in the entire economy of push and pull, when it comes to the push factor, you have stopped it. So women will not be educated further. Then how are you going to have an inclusive society in the coming days?
Sir, for me, again, the Chinese proverbs that rather than giving a fish, teach them how to catch the fish. So, yes, Afghanistan needs humanitarian aid, definitely and for sure. But more importantly, to me, I mean, Afghanistan needs international recognition. Once you have the international recognition, so they will have the access to their financial assets. They will have their financial system. They will have the recognition from the international community to develop the international relationship, and then they can have obviously the easy business and the I mean all the daily life that they can spend with the international community. The only and the big challenge right now, that's the international recognition. But yes, that's true. The international recognition is linked with the women or the inclusivity, all the government, the different conditions from the international community. But to me, I mean, if the international community or the US can solve the whole Afghanistan war and can talk to the Taliban and can have an agreement, so why not can be an agreement on the inclusive government or the women inclusion?
Because whosoever will sign will be shunted to one side and they'll do whatever they keep on doing.
I agree. There is another conspiracy theory that Afghanistan, I mean, I'm so sorry to say, but that has been stigmatized with the defeat. That for those people, and especially the international community, who want to come to Afghanistan or who will be recognizing first to Afghanistan, which means that they will be going to defeat in Afghanistan again. So nobody bother or nobody want to come to Afghanistan to have, so do not have that defeat stigma on their face.
No, but sending an army and recognizing a country or an organization are two different things.
Yes, I agree. Again, the male culprit to me, that's the US. US has signed the agreement, and again,
culprit. Or the instigator.
Or quote unquote the culprit. Yes. The reason
You are
is that
entitled to your views and
the reason is that to me, Taliban government come into power based on the Doha agreements, and Doha agreements legitimize them, and they bring them. So obviously, it's the bigger stake has the U.S. and the U.S. has the bigger stake. So obviously, they have to come forward. Last night, the chairman of the Foreign Committee for the Senate, Senator Bob. He said, I mean, he not only told or to the media there in the U.S. that the Joe Biden should talk to the Prime Minister Imran Khan for the humanitarian to avert the humanitarian crisis and all that stuff. And I mean, he said that if there was an agreement, we should build on that agreement.
Okay, I don't want to bring in this telephone call into this discussion. Although we saw John Kerry meeting the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the word has it that still no call. There is not going to be a call. But regardless, let me go back to Michael Kugelman. Michael, one thing that I want to understand, usually international politics doesn't function in vacuum. There is a country, a big country called Afghanistan. It has, a big population as well, 40 million. Amazingly, at this moment, we don't know whether the UN recognizes any government there. What is the status of the current government, and who, according to at least de jure level, who exactly is the ruler of Afghanistan now that Ashraf Ghani and his government have already resigned?
You see many officials in Western countries go through a lot of rhetorical gymnastics to try to figure out how to refer to this government in Afghanistan. Some refer to it as the Taliban regime, some refer to it as the de facto government, others refer to it as the Taliban government. But clearly, I mean, I think that as a matter of practicality, and especially given the stakes with the humanitarian crisis, I think that we all have to accept the fact that the Taliban is in control. Accepting doesn't mean recognizing or legitimizing, even though, as was noted, the Doha agreement really legitimized the U.S., legitimized the Taliban, and certainly the U.S. legitimized it. I think that, the challenge now, moving forward, is to figure out how to square this policy circle, so to speak, of providing assistance to Afghanistan without going through a Taliban government that no country in the world has been willing to recognize, and likely won't anytime soon. I think it's clear that no country wants to be the first country to recognize the Taliban. There are countries that may be willing to be the third or fourth country, but not the first. So I think that this brings to mind a very difficult question, right? It's clear that there's a strong desire to bring assistance to the Afghan people, but this gets to the issue of what to do about that $10 billion that the U.S. and the West have frozen as part of the sanctions regime against the Taliban government. Now, one could argue that maybe that could be released, but it could still be kept away from the Afghan government. But for me, one question that oftentimes is not posed is, let's say that somehow the West agrees to unfreeze that $10 billion in foreign reserves so that the Taliban government can get to it. Even if the Taliban were to suddenly have access to that $10 billion, would the Taliban have the capacity to actually absorb and use that amount of money and be in a position to distribute it to those that need it the most? In other words, would the Taliban actually be able to successfully draw on those funds to ease the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan? And I think that the answer, quite simply, is no. And that's why, for all these arguments that the U.S. has to remove sanctions on the Taliban and get this money to Afghanistan for the sake of the people in the humanitarian crisis, it makes sense. But let's keep in mind that even if that money were to be turned over to the Taliban, it wouldn't necessarily be in a position to know how to use it. And that, I think, highlights an important point, that there is going to have to be some degree of engagement and negotiations with the Taliban on the humanitarian crisis.
And that is a point well made. I want you to actually, as an expert on international relations, as an academic also, help me understand what is the status of Afghanistan right now when it comes to, their status on books. Last time Taliban were in government, Ahmad Shah Massoud's government was thought to be the de jure government, right? At this moment, who is actually the jure authority that Afghanistan, the American or the international community refers to, or there is none, and it is a situation like the movie called The Terminal?
Well, I think that there's no. I really don't think that there's been any formal recognition of an alternate government. For instance, the resistance, the Panjshir resistance, which, as I think we can agree, its top leadership is now based in Tajikistan. You have not seen the U.S. reach out to extend recognition to that government, to that resistance. Now, certainly, given what happened with Ashraf Ghani and his government over its last few weeks in power, you're certainly not seeing the U.S. or any other Western country rushing to recognize Ghani and his whatever few remaining allies he has, and there aren't that many of them. So, basically, this is why I go back to what I said before. We have to accept the fact that the Taliban is in control, even if we don't recognize it. And I think that applies to Washington as well, because there's no other entity or interlocutor that the U.S. or other countries would have in this regard. There is no alternate government. And I think this is not 2001, where we could seriously expect the U.S. and other external players to throw their weight and support behind the Northern Alliance. That's not going to happen at this point, and especially because the Taliban controls more territory now than it did in the 90s, when you did have holdout areas where you had an anti-Taliban resistance. There isn't much of a resistance.
That's a good point. Let me come back to Brigadier Janjua. How can you have a vacuum, right, when it comes to international law, when it comes to the UN? Because at this moment it seems that Afghanistan has lost its voice as well. Now it cannot speak at the UN. It cannot interact with EU or anybody else. Whosoever comes to Afghanistan with any kind of dole out will be treated one way or the other, but you cannot go out. That becomes a problem.
Yes, that's a problem, and that is why we say that you don't turn a country which is trying to find its feet into a stillborn baby.
Yeah.
If you freeze their 9 billion, and I do not agree with respectfully Kugelman when he says that they don't know what to do with that money. Well, that money is very crucial.
No, but they have to know how to run the business.
They have a system of governance, and there are, despite the brain drain and the people who have left, there are still government branches which are working and they are struggling hard, but they are hit very badly by the liquidity crunch.
Right.
These two things are striking them: non-recognition and the liquidity crunch. And liquidity crunch, why it is so crucial? They have $90 million of 3 months bills which have to be paid to Iran, to Tajikistan, to Uzbekistan. So far they have not turned out the lights, but how long will they continue? So somebody's got to give them money to pay their bills. Why do you want to asphyxiate a country which is still trying to find its feet?
There can be a workaround. If some services are being provided to Afghanistan, these authorities can directly pay them. But my concern right now, and you said that they know how to run the business, or they would. The concern is that when they took over, the word has it that they went to the central bank and said, show us the $8 billion that are there. And then they were told that they are not kept here. So if your worldview is so simplistic and you don't even know where the money is at, that is New York, then how are you going to run the business of government?
You see, they will take recourse to experts, and there
Can
are
you give me an
available.
example apart from health ministry, where it became something of necessity?
Because somebody was running their DAB, and
they left.
And they left, and they can come back, because if there is something to come back to. Because if there is nothing, people will not come into a black hole. They need liquidity, incidentally, for their humanitarian needs as well, because the IDPs which are gathering into those makeshift camps and right in the middle of Kabul at the moment. Now, there was a need assessment, and somebody asked those people, what do you need most? You need any kind of help here, we should establish a camp for you, or so they said no, just give us some money, we can go back to our homes, repair our tenements, tend to our business, take care of our cattle and buy some essentials. Now and this was precisely the experience here, and in many ways there are similarities also.
You're talking about legal tender. But their legal tender is actually something that is not even patented in their country. It is patented in Poland, right?
No,
so
everybody knows that those issues, but
there is limited currency, and the problem is because they have stopped using it outside Afghanistan, it has not crashed, but its value keeps on depreciating every day because inflation keeps on rising. At this moment, they need expertise, and perhaps that's why everybody keeps on saying, be more inclusive, be more, flexible.
I have a counter question. Do you compound the problem for them by denying them the liquidity, or you can help them by providing the liquidity?
If you are in a country that actually stays hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away, and they have other pressing businesses, they might actually forget that you even existed. And that is a problem.
You see, that definition of inclusivity also has to be very carefully discussed, because
they agree to it in Doha.
They are doing a second mistake, the international community.
No, but you have to see that Taliban are doing something wrong as well.
See, the nation
you cannot say that.
For 20 years you could not do a nation building. You wanted to build nation as per your own model.
Yeah, but
and you yourself, Biden is on record as
having. I have to go to Asad Saab as well, but very humbly I have to just point out that in these 20 years, new people were born, they grew up, they got accustomed to education and more liberties. You cannot wish them away. This is not to 1999, Afghanistan.
One way of doing is to unfreeze their reserves.
I don't, actually I'm not arguing against that. All I'm saying is somebody has to go and convince the Taliban to be more flexible as well.
I agree.
Otherwise it will not happen. Asad Johnson.
So, well, to me, I think the real challenge for the Taliban starts after the 16th of August. The reason is that to remain in opposition and to fight from the mountains and within the mountains for 20 years or maybe 20 centuries, I mean, this wouldn't cost you a lot. Yes, maybe humans, maybe others, but once you in the power and to run the government, that's the biggest challenge. And right now, yes, Taliban do have that. And from the day one, if the international community is talking about the inclusive government or the women's rights, I think being a democratic state or to being a state governor to govern the state, I think it's for the biggest stake, for the biggest interest of the people, you should accept that.
Yeah, but they very proudly tell you they are not a democracy. Democracy is not an Afghan concept. It is not a Muslim concept.
Yes.
They are an emirate.
Well, I think that's another debate. I mean, how they will do in the near future and how they will elect their prime minister or the head of the state in the near future. But
here's what I found on the web.
Right.
Okay.
This happens sometimes. Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
But right now, I think whatever they do have whatever they are in the government, they should be more flexible. They should be more adaptive, and they should hurt the international community.
Another very simple question for you, and that is about evolution. I understand Afghanistan could not evolve the institutions ground up, and they were imposed, and that's why they're gone. I understand that the Afghan Taliban were also, when they were fighting, we thought that they are evolving as well. I cannot tell you how many programs I had here where my guests sat and told me they are not the same people, right?
Yeah.
Their interpretation of jurisprudence seems to be even relegating or going back, regressing. Is there a possibility that all the Muslim countries, especially their clerics, can compel them to upgrade their vision of women's rights? understanding of minorities and how they are treated, at least so that understand how things are done?
Well, I think that's again a very difficult question to be answered. I mean, which Islam or which Islamic scholars? The reason is that in every Muslim state, they have their own jurisprudence or their own interpretation. Yes, Saudi Arab.
Cairo University can help.
Yes, they can do.
Madaris in Pakistan can help.
Yes, definitely.
When it comes to Shias, Iran can help.
Yes,
So they are there.
definitely can do that. But the problem is, I mean, they are keeping that not that much flexible in a sense. For example, in
Is
the cabinet,
anybody trying at this moment to convince them religiously?
I think Pakistan is doing their best.
Right.
Doing their best in a sense that the one thing which need to be flexible, for example, in Afghanistan they have like a 42% Pashtun population.
Okay.
And when it's come to the inclusive government, I think it's like 95% of their cabinet are Pashtuns.
Right. I'm told that we have run out of time. We are left with 2 minutes, I'm told. But I'm going to actually extend that into 3 and 3.5. Let me ask Michael Kugelman to conclude. Your concluding thoughts, sir, very quickly.
Well, you know, I think that the stakes could not be higher, right? Just today we heard the World Food Program director say that we're looking at the reality of almost 23 million Afghans marching towards starvation. That was his quote. That's more than half the population, right? We're not talking only about more than half the population being food insecure. We're talking about more than half the population marching towards starvation. This is horrifying. And this is why I think that groups like the UN and as well as private charitable groups are going to become increasingly important, because these are the entities that the US and the West, other countries in the West, will need to work with on the ground in Afghanistan to ensure that all of this money that is starting to be pledged by the international community will come into Afghanistan, and that humanitarian supplies will get to the Afghans that need it without working with the Taliban. So that's why I think that the UN is going to take center stage, or has to take center stage in the days ahead.
That's a good point. But let me, when I ask you about the conclusion, let me give you a counter question as well. We have heard EU, we have heard various individual countries aiding Afghanistan. We haven't heard about OSCE. We haven't heard the name of Arab League, or for that matter any other country or group of that sort that might have played a role here. I don't see them.
I entirely agree with you. That's an effete body, and it's got to be more proactive to play an important part, because we are staring into a humanitarian crisis. This is no time to even debate nation building and recreating Afghanistan as per the definition of inclusivity and human rights. That's a pie in the sky. 22.8 million people, which is nearly 2/3 of the population of Afghanistan, are staring into the abyss of a humanitarian catastrophe. These are not my words. These are the words of
nobody is disagreeing with that. Everybody sees the point, but perhaps convincing the rulers in Kabul will help their lot, their future, not merely anybody who wants to help them. I'm told we are run out of time. We have run out of time. Asad, very quickly, your conclusion, sir.
Well, I think the international community should keep their egos beside.
Everyone should.
Or everyone should. And they should immediately recognize the Taliban government. The thing is that once you have that recognition and that legitimate status, I think for me, in my personal opinion, that can solve most of the Afghanistan problem once that has been recognized.
Right. I'm told now I have to conclude. Thank you very much, Asad Jansar. Thank you very much for your precious time. Brigadier Saab, always great having you on the show. Michael, thank you very much for your precious time. You always bring in a very unique perspective. Thank you very much. Viewers, we don't have that kind of time, so I'm very quickly just going to point out one aspect which is important. When it comes to humanitarian issues, nobody denies it is going to be horrible. I understand that the international community might be looking at various other developing stories like Sudan, Ethiopia, others. But Afghanistan's winters and the kind of food crisis we are hearing about at this moment, especially when we move forward in coming months, it can become so horrible that it can shake anybody's conscience. It is important to focus on this simultaneously for Muslim countries especially, because they might have some leeway with the Afghan Taliban. It is crucial to gently nudge them towards doing the right things, which entitle them to more recognition all over the world. This was today's program. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.